Well, it looks like we're in it. Gee, I wish I could go.
What kind of pain makes a man miss his best friend's funeral? Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy were more than just comedy legends. They were two halves of a soul that made the world laugh for decades. But when Oliver Hardy died, Stan Laurel, his lifelong friend, his partner in chaos, his brother in everything but blood, was nowhere to be seen at the funeral. No last goodbye, no tearful farewell, just silence. To fans around the world, it looked like betrayal, but the real reason, it wasn't petty, it wasn't pride, it was something far more human and far more heartbreaking. This isn't just the story of a missed funeral. This is a story about a friendship that defied time, fame, failure, and even death. And the final chapter will break your heart. Comedy's most beloved duo. They were an odd pair at first glance, one tall and thin, with a face full of confusion and wonder, the other short, stout, and full of exaggerated pride. But together, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy became pure magic. Their contrast didn't clash, it danced. It was rhythm, timing, and balance. And in that odd little dance, they created something the world had never seen before. Laurel blinked with innocence. Hardy rolled his eyes with exasperation. One looked helpless, the other looked annoyed, and yet somehow both made you laugh until your stomach hurt. Their chemistry wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't forced. It just existed, like lightning in a bottle. They made over 100 films together. And what's wild is, they didn't need fast dialogue or fancy punchlines. Their secret was something much older, the silent symphony of slapstick, timing, and emotional beats. Just a pause, a glance, a double take, and the whole theater would erupt. That's why their fame wasn't limited to America. Europe adored them, children knew them, adults cherished them. Their theme song, the Cuckoo Song, became so iconic that the moment it played, people knew, it's Laurel and Hardy time. Laughter was coming. But beneath all that laughter, something else lingered. A story not told in gags and routines. Because behind the curtain of comedy, both men were carrying more than anyone ever realized. And when they first met, no one, not even them, could have imagined what was about to be born. The first encounter and rise to stardom. Their first meeting wasn't headline-worthy. No fireworks, no instant magic, just two actors trying to survive Hollywood's chaos. It was 1921, and the film was The Lucky Dog, a short silent comedy where Stan Laurel played a homeless man and Oliver Hardy played the crook who tried to rob him. They barely shared any screen time. At the time, neither had any idea they were filming the beginning of a comedy revolution. Both men were drifting, hopping from film to film, paycheck to paycheck. Laurel had just broken from vaudeville, staying behind in America after touring with Fred Karno's troupe, the same one that gave Charlie Chaplin his big break. In fact, Laurel had once been Chaplin's understudy, quietly absorbing lessons in silence, expression, and timing. He didn't know it then, but those quiet lessons would become his greatest tools. Hardy, on the other hand, had taken a different road. He sang in theaters, worked the vaudeville circuit, picked up roles wherever he could. He wasn't flashy, but he was reliable. He could play the heavy, the brute, the buffoon, and audiences loved him for it. By 1927, fate finally caught up with them. Hal Roach Studios paired them officially in Putting Pants on Philip, and from that first scene, it clicked. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in a rhythm. Laurel's innocent glances met Hardy's irritated glares with perfect comic timing. Their contrast wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. One represented chaos, the other illusion of control. Together, they made disaster look beautiful. Hollywood hadn't seen anything quite like them before, and neither had the world. Laurel's perfectionism and personal turmoil. Stan Laurel may have played the fool, but in reality, he was the mastermind. He didn't just perform comedy, he lived inside it. Every frame, every pause, every perfectly timed fall was engineered by him like clockwork. While Oliver Hardy trusted the flow and took direction, Stan rewrote the blueprint for what comedy could be. And the pressure to keep it perfect? It slowly crushed him. He was never officially credited as director, but everyone at Hal Roach Studios knew the truth. Stan wrote the gags, he edited the reels, he micromanaged set design, lighting, and wardrobe, even how a hat should tilt on Hardy's head. To Stan, there were no small details. A pause that lasted too long, a glance held too briefly, it could ruin an entire scene. And so he would stay up late in the cutting room, adjusting footage by fractions of a second until it felt right. His genius was undeniable, but so was the cost. Emotionally, he was unraveling. His personal life was a maze of failed love, broken trust, and self-sabotage. 5 marriages and still no peace. He married 4 different women, one of them twice, and each time he believed it would finally work, until it didn't. His relationship with May Dolberg was toxic and explosive. She was jealous, unpredictable, and overly involved in his work. She even claimed she invented the name Stan Laurel, convincing him to change it from his birth name, Arthur Jefferson, to something more fitting for the marquee. But her influence turned dark. She interrupted rehearsals, challenged directors on set, and threatened to derail his entire career. It got so bad, producer Joe Rock paid her $10,000 to leave the country, a move so desperate it sounds like fiction, but it was real. Even after that, things never really stabilized. His marriage to Lois Nielsen seemed promising at first. They had 2 children together, but Stan's obsession with work drove a wedge between them. They divorced, and Stan entered a revolving door of relationships. Virginia Ruth Rogers, Vera Shuvalova, then back to Ruth again. It wasn't about being unfaithful or cruel, he was just emotionally scattered, never still, always searching for something he couldn't define. And all the while the weight of being Laurel never left him. Where Hardy could finish a shoot and disappear into a golf course or cocktail party, Stan carried the studio home in his coat pocket. He was restless, constantly scribbling ideas on napkins, tweaking jokes in the middle of the night, or calling editors because a single beat had been bothering him for days. Coworkers said he would rehearse a scene for hours, then throw it out entirely if it didn't feel right. To him, comedy wasn't instinct, it was architecture. And that kind of precision demanded sacrifice. It left him emotionally depleted, physically worn down, and often isolated from the people who loved him. By the 1940s, the cracks began to show. Stan was diagnosed with diabetes. His heart was failing. But still, he refused to slow down. Even when he was too weak to stand on stage, he would sit in a chair and rewrite sketches, many of which never got made. He had built an empire from laughter. But now that laughter echoed back at him, hollow and faint. The industry was changing. Audiences were moving on, and everything he had poured his soul into was starting to look like a fading photograph. Stan Laurel had given his life to comedy, but the tragedy was, comedy never gave him peace. Hardy's struggles behind the smile. Oliver Hardy was the gentle storm behind the thunderous laughs, charming, warm, and endlessly patient. On screen, he was the puffed-up perfectionist, constantly undone by Stan's clumsiness. But off-screen, the man behind that famous double take was weathering a quiet collapse. He seemed light-hearted, easygoing, the type of man who could shrug off setbacks with a smile. But underneath that surface was a man stretched thin by emotional chaos and personal disappointment. His marriages mirrored the instability of his fame. The most turbulent was his second to Myrtle Reeves. She struggled with alcoholism, and the relationship quickly turned toxic. Friends described late-night fights, broken promises, and the exhaustion that followed him to the set. Hardy, who had always been quick to forgive, often blamed himself, but he carried that guilt like a stone. Even his third marriage, to Lucille Jones, the most stable of them all, wasn't enough to undo the years of damage. Lucille cared for him deeply, but by then Hardy had learned how to smile through pain without showing the cracks. He was emotionally fragile, but too proud to ask for help. And then there was the money, or the lack of it. Hardy was generous to a fault. If someone needed help, he gave it. If he had it, he spent it. But that kindness made him an easy target. He trusted advisors who mishandled his finances. He gave blindly, assuming the next job would cover the last mistake. But jobs weren't always there. By the 1930s and 40s, the tax man came knocking. His debts grew. There were periods when he took smaller, lesser roles just to stay ahead of the bills. And while Stan Laurel controlled everything on set, from the angle of a shot to the buttons on a jacket, Hardy often felt like a passenger in his own career. He was content to follow the rhythm, but sometimes that rhythm left him behind. There were times he questioned it all, not publicly, not dramatically, just in those quiet in-between moments when the laughter faded and the dressing room lights dimmed. What was left after the applause? Who was he without the hat, the cane, the fat jokes? Even his health betrayed him. He gained weight steadily throughout his career. Audiences loved it. They laughed at it, but it took a toll. Joint pain, fatigue, shortness of breath. His body was begging him to stop, but he kept going. Behind the scenes, his friendship with Laurel wasn't always easy either. Stan's obsession with perfection sometimes clashed with Hardy's more relaxed approach. There were arguments over scripts, blocking, decisions that left Hardy feeling steamrolled. Some days they barely spoke between takes, but they always showed up, always delivered, always forgave. And yet, despite all of this, the health scares, the money problems, the emotional weight, Hardy never let his fans see him break. To the public, he was still Ollie, the same man tripping over chairs, puffing with pride, and getting dunked in bathtubs. The illusion never shattered. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Oliver Hardy was a man quietly slipping into the background of his own story. A comedy empire in decline. By the late 1940s, the world that once worshipped Laurel and Hardy had started to move on. The laughter hadn't stopped, but it had changed. A new generation of audiences wanted something slicker, faster, more modern. Slapstick, the slow-burn chaos that defined Laurel and Hardy, began to feel like a relic. Studios were chasing fresh faces. Sound films were evolving. Timing was tighter. Jokes were punchier. And Laurel and Hardy? They were still doing what they did best, but fewer people were watching. Then came Untold in 1951, their final film, and it was a disaster. The script was weak, the production a mess. French and Italian crews clashed on set, creating chaos behind the camera that no amount of comedy could fix in front of it. Both men were in poor health. Laurel's diabetes was worsening. Hardy was exhausted and heavier than ever. What was supposed to be a triumphant return turned into a painful farewell. The jokes didn't land. The rhythm was off. Even die-hard fans struggled to laugh. For the first time, the magic didn't just feel faded, it felt gone. But the most painful part? They knew it. They could feel the end creeping in, not just of their careers but of an entire era. Silent comedy, physical storytelling, and the innocent charm they'd built their lives on was slipping through their fingers. Untold didn't just close a chapter, it slammed the door shut. And behind that door, two aging legends were left wondering what was left of the world they'd once ruled. The end of the road. By the early 1950s, the man once known as the indestructible half of Hollywood's greatest comedy duo was quietly disappearing, and the world didn't even realize it. Oliver Hardy's weight, once central to his comedic identity, had become a ticking time bomb. Fans thought of it as part of the act, the physical contrast that made Laurel and Hardy so visually funny. But Hardy had carried that burden for years. The laughs were real, so was the strain. His joints ached, his breathing worsened. His heart, quietly under siege from decades of wear and neglect, was faltering. Then in 1954, the first heart attack came. It wasn't a collapse on set. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to change everything. Doctors gave him a grim ultimatum: change your lifestyle, or don't expect to see many more birthdays. Hardy, shaken for the first time in years, listened. He cut back. He changed his diet. He took it seriously. And the weight began to melt off. Over the next several months, he lost more than 150 pounds. It was a staggering transformation, and not the kind that inspired applause. People were horrified. When he reappeared in public, even close friends didn't recognize him. His clothes hung off him like curtains. His cheeks were hollow. His trademark softness, the very shape that had made him beloved, was gone. He looked like a ghost of himself. Tabloids speculated wildly. Cancer, mystery illness, depression. Rumors flew, but Hardy stayed quiet. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't owe anyone one. In reality, he was just trying to survive. But it was already too late. The years of abuse had done their damage. His heart couldn't bounce back. His lungs, blackened from years of smoking, made every breath a struggle. The man who once bounded up staircases and threw himself into pratfalls now moved slowly, cautiously. He stopped accepting film offers. No more public appearances. The cameras, once his playground, now felt like an accusation. Then in 1956, the final blow landed. A massive stroke hit, leaving Hardy paralyzed and speechless. The man whose entire career had been built on subtle facial expressions, precise timing, and physical humor, could no longer move or speak. He was trapped in silence. Stan Laurel wrote, called, checked in constantly, but Hardy, once full of life, couldn't respond. Friends described his eyes as tired, not just from the stroke, but from the weight of a body and career that had both run their course. Hardy never recovered. In August 1957, just a year after the first stroke, two more followed in quick succession. His body, once the engine of so much joy, finally gave out. On August 7, 1957, Oliver Norvell Hardy died from cerebral thrombosis. He was 65. Hollywood paused. Tributes came from every corner. Comedians who had grown up idolizing him shared memories. Film studios played reruns. Families rewatched the classics. People laughed through tears. But there was a different kind of grief in the air. This wasn't just the death of a man. It felt like the loss of an era, of a type of comedy, of a kind of innocence, of two friends who once ruled the world with nothing more than a camera and a pie to the face. Hardy's final years were quiet, but his final absence from screens, from stages, from the laughter he helped create, was deafening. And in that silence, one man was grieving in a way that would leave the world wondering for decades. Stan's controversial absence. The day of the funeral came quietly. August 1957, a warm California morning at Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. Friends, family, and old studio colleagues gathered to say goodbye to Oliver Hardy, the man who had brought so much laughter to so many lives. But something, or rather someone, was missing. There was an empty seat in the front row, reserved, expected, but never filled. Stan Laurel never showed up. And just like that, the headlines shifted. What was supposed to be a tribute to Hardy became a flood of speculation about Laurel. Fans were confused. Journalists were relentless. How could he miss the funeral of the man he'd shared nearly every frame of his career with? To the outside world, it looked like abandonment, or worse, bitterness. Some whispered that maybe they'd had a falling out, that maybe the final years had created too much tension. Others said Stan couldn't face the guilt, that maybe the decline in their partnership, their last terrible film, their lost relevance, had broken something inside him. Conspiracy spun in every direction, but none of it was true. The real reason was simple and devastating. Stan Laurel was in no shape to attend. His health had been crumbling for years. Diabetes, heart issues, and the crushing emotional weight of watching everything he'd built with Hardy fade away. When the news of Hardy's death reached him, it shattered him. His doctor warned that attending the funeral might trigger a collapse. Stan's body wasn't just tired, it was failing. And more than that, his heart couldn't take it. When asked why he didn't attend, Stan gave a quiet, heart-wrenching response. Babe would understand. Babe. That was his name for Hardy. The nickname he'd used for decades. In letters, in conversations, even when no one else was around. Just Babe. Those three words said everything. Because Stan wasn't avoiding Hardy. He was honoring him in the only way he could. By not making the funeral about himself. He knew the cameras would turn toward him. The spotlight would shift. The grief would become a spectacle. And Hardy's final goodbye would be lost in noise. Stan didn't want that. He chose to grieve in silence. But of course the public didn't know that. Not then. And the misunderstanding only deepened the pain. The truth behind the decision. Stan Laurel's absence at Oliver Hardy's funeral wasn't just a headline. It became a mystery that haunted fans for decades. Why didn't he go? Why didn't the man who had shared more than 100 films, countless tours, and a lifetime of laughter stand by his partner one final time? The answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was heartbreak, plain and devastating. By 1957, Stan Laurel was physically frail and emotionally hollow. The death of Oliver Hardy wasn't just the loss of a friend, it was the loss of half of himself. Stan had diabetes, heart problems, and constant fatigue. His doctor told him outright, attending the funeral could kill him. The stress, the travel, the emotional weight of it all, it wasn't worth the risk. But even if Stan had been strong enough to go, he wouldn't have. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He knew what would happen if he appeared at the funeral. The cameras would flash, reporters would swarm, photographs of a grief-stricken Laurel would fill front pages. It wouldn't be about Hardy anymore. It would be about Stan's pain, Stan's tears, Stan's frailty. He couldn't let that happen. Hardy deserved a day that was only his. So Stan stayed home, in silence, alone with his memories. When asked why, he simply said, "Babe would understand." That nickname, Babe, was sacred. Stan had called Oliver that since the very beginning. He used it in letters, in interviews, even in scripts. It was more than a pet name. It was a reminder that no matter how famous they became, they were always just two friends, doing something they loved. After the funeral, Stan didn't give interviews or public statements. He didn't need to. His grief was lived in the shadows. He never returned to performing. Not even once. Producers offered him roles. Networks begged for interviews. Film festivals wanted tributes. But Stan refused. Without Hardy, the act was over. There would be no solo career, no Laurel without Hardy. They were a single creation, indivisible. Instead, he lived quietly in a small Santa Monica apartment, surrounded by reminders of what once was. There were shelves of scripts, drawers full of fan mail, framed photos of their early days. On his desk, piles of sketches and routines he kept writing, even though he knew they'd never be filmed. Some still had Hardy's name written beside his own. He just couldn't stop imagining they'd work together again. Visitors described the experience as surreal, stepping into a time capsule. Stan would smile, tell stories, even perform little routines just for fun. But the moment you asked about Oliver, his eyes would dim, the laughter would fade. He missed him, every day. Even in retirement, he stayed connected to fans. He answered their letters personally, sometimes with long, heartfelt replies. He never let the world forget what they'd built. In 1961, the Academy finally honored him with an honorary Oscar, a symbol of everything he had contributed to the art of comedy. But true to form, Stan didn't attend. He sent a thank you, but preferred to stay home. The applause didn't mean the same without the man who had stood beside him on every stage. And then, on February 23, 1965, Stan Laurel died of a heart attack. He was 74. He died alone, but not forgotten. Not by fans, not by the world, and certainly not by those who understood the quiet weight he had carried for so long. Stan Laurel didn't attend Oliver Hardy's funeral, but he mourned him for the rest of his life. Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy made the world laugh like few ever could. But behind the jokes and slapstick routines was a friendship deeper than most people ever knew. A bond that never needed the spotlight, applause, or even a final goodbye to prove its strength. Stan didn't attend Hardy's funeral, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made their story so timeless. Even now, decades later, fans still feel the echo of their laughter and the quiet heartbreak behind it. But what do you think? Was Stan right to stay away? Or should he have been there no matter what? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you loved this story, there's more where that came from. Click the next video on your screen for another untold chapter from Hollywood's golden age. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more stories that dive deeper than headlines, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment from the legends you grew up with. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep remembering the ones who made us smile.